All right, we are live and we will be beginning in about 2 minutes, everyone. Thank you for being here. We will be beginning in less than a minute. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Mary Rubin, and I am the past president of the Society of Florida Archivists. Today marks the start of our SFA Archives Month webinars. We will be holding all questions until the end of the webinar. Today we have Rachel Duke, the Rare Books Librarian at Florida State University, and Rory Grennan, the Manuscripts Archivist at Florida State University. Today they will be talking about moving team-based special collections instruction online. And with that, I hand it over to Rory.
All right, how's everybody doing today? As Mary said, we're going to be talking about team-based special collections instruction and moving that online today, specifically about how it's been done over the last few months at Florida State University. For those of you who don't know, well, a lot of the services we're going to talk about today are really aimed at our main campus in Tallahassee. 2019 enrollment was somewhere around 41,000 students. A little context for you there. All the students are served by 73 library faculty and uncountable full-time and part-time staff across multiple campuses and really across Florida and all around the world. And we do get opportunities to interact with all of those populations. The Special Collections and Archives Division, which Rachel and I are both part of, consists of 8 faculty, 6 full-time staff, and whatever hourly staff the annual budget will allow for. Among that, important for our presentation today is knowing that there's really no position devoted entirely to public services. In the division, a lot of us have a little responsibility rather than one person having a lot of responsibility. Also useful in discussion today and in our services is the Digital Library Center. The place in the library that does a lot of our digitization services is within the Special Collections and Archives, and you'll see how that affects communication and workflow around online instruction. Our user groups are, I imagine, pretty typical of college and university academic archives. Certainly there are the students, undergraduate and graduate at FSU. We work with faculty, those 2 groups, especially in instruction, but we're also an important resource for administrators at FSU, all kinds of visiting scholars, community groups. Our instruction group has interacted with K-12 students and students from other institutions. Our outreach group, we talk to the Girl Scouts. We really try to get a lot of different groups connected with our materials. A few of our areas of collection strength there. University history, as you might expect, represented by those students. Bowling at the dearly departed Crenshaw Lanes there. Florida history, civil and human rights, French history, history of the book, poetry, children's literature. These are all areas that are important to all of our public services, but have they all play a part, especially in our instruction services as well. About 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, we moved to this group approach to doing instruction services in special collections and archives. Fall of 2017, We were looking at the departure of a faculty member from Special Collections and Archives who did a lot of instruction services. We knew there was not going to be an immediate replacement. It's kind of left an instruction team of one. Not that there was only one person doing instruction, but a lot of like the generic requests for instruction support coming to the division were now just sort of coming to one person. Also, you know, somebody's departure leaves gaps in institutional and collections knowledge, and certainly the real problem of hours that were devoted to a lot of different services were now lost. So we had to find a way to make that up. We also, the number of class visit requests had remained fairly consistent over the last couple of years, about 50 a year. And we had up until then had an emphasis on trying to do close collaboration with course instructors. We wanted to keep all that, so thus we formed the instruction group. It was a new team that was recruited from our existing reference and research services staff. They brought a variety of experience in doing instruction and doing public services and even in working in special collections. But instituting that team approach and really good communication helped share labor and expertise across sort of all those people and all those different backgrounds. The team approach has remained in effect since then. We regularly field, discuss, and delegate requests for instruction as a group. Having a group's calendar rather than just a couple individuals gives us flexibility in scheduling class visits to our public spaces, and especially in being able to accommodate the course calendar in scheduling those class visits. Allowing them to happen when the students are already used to meeting rather than scheduling a special time to come see special collections. We work together. We're sort of constantly refining workflows and our documentation to make everything work just a little bit better all the time. And our session planning continues to emphasize adapting to course objectives brought to us by course instructors rather than just deploying like the orientation to special collections. Continue to emphasize up until that point in-person active learning and bringing in standards like the SAA RBMS guidelines for primary source literacy. Since 2017, we've been able to renew and sustain partnerships in core academic disciplines across the university and relationships with other libraries units. Our capacity to execute sessions was able to expand dramatically when that vacated position we were talking about was eventually filled, which we'll demonstrate in a minute. And pretty much started spring 2020, everything was perfect and nothing needed to change. You can see here some of the progress we were able to make. Our team approach, that vacancy we're talking about sort of happened right in here between the 2016-2017 and the 2017-2018 academic year. And you can see from the graph that we were able to field requests and execute a similar number of sessions those 2 years, even without that, even with the loss of that faculty position. Then when it was filled the next year, you can see over the next 2 years, we're able to really make dramatic progress. And that was due to the team approach. If you have sharp eyes and you're paying attention, you see that there is an asterisk there next to the last academic year noted, 2019-2020. That's because just like all of you, our spring 2020 was kind of special. And Rachel's going to tell you about that right now.
Yeah, so the story behind the asterisk is my little section here. We originally planned for 38 class visits that were already scheduled across a variety of subjects, and you can see some of those subjects listed. While a few of them were based on previously executed classes and depended on recycled pull lists, we were trying our hand at a few of these. They were new to us, and we were building something from scratch. 7 total Special Collections and Archives instruction team members were signed on to handle these classes and had begun communication with requesters already. And a few of these planned visits were multiple sessions designed to assist students in scaffolding an approach to a final project based on Special Collections materials, which raised some complications when we hit March 16th, which is the date that will live in infamy. We started to think of the semester in pre-March 16th and post-March 16th kind of terms. It was the Monday of FSU spring break, and a lot of students had just left. And it is the date also that many of us started to think about how we were going to work remotely. March 17th was the first instruction group meeting where we addressed moving instruction online, and we had all just received notice that the governor was instituting a stay-at-home order for a 2-week period. So our agenda notes from the meeting include a very helpful note, March 23rd to April 5th at least. And today, looking back, that's a little comical that we were hoping to have an end in sight. There was like a sense of awareness then, though, that we might be looking at a much longer term to adapt to. In the week that followed, it became clear we needed to centralize communication around the 17 classes that remained for the semester. And because we operate in the group format that Rory mentioned, we individually handle communication with the instructors whose classes we've signed up to handle. And so this approach ended up being a really good method, actually, in a crisis. So in the March 17th meeting, we discussed deploying a survey to the remaining instructors, and that wasn't very successful. I think just because everyone's emails were really piled up with notices about COVID, and we kind of had a hunch then. We got 2 responses immediately, but then heard from no one else. Everyone was just overwhelmed, and I can understand that from my own experience of those days. So with so few responses, we needed to find a way to connect and catch each other up on the status of things. And so we, in March 24th, turned back to our group approach and said, who has heard from instructors? What's the plan going forward? And we created a column in our class spreadsheet to record the status of the adaptation portion of this crisis. So as we pivoted to reimagining upcoming classes in the online environment, we also realized quickly that we needed to upgrade some of our online resources. We've maintained a catalogs and databases page on the library website for years, but it was very text heavy in its original incarnation. And we revamped that page and filmed 2-minute tutorial videos on how to use our 3 main search portals: the library catalog archive space, or finding a database, and FSU's digital repository. And this provided an easy page to point to during online instruction sessions that could provide asynchronous access for instructors to guide students to how to find materials with us. And that could be used with class visits or even just patrons who were looking for materials. So when we look back on the spring semester, the numbers tell the story. Of 17 sessions that were scheduled following the stay-at-home order, so after March 16th, 5 became synchronous Zoom sessions. 9 of them were reimagined as asynchronous projects with content provided by our team. Only 3 of the sessions were canceled outright, and ultimately 250 of the original 300 students that were signed up for instruction remained supported by our team. We reported these stats in our earlier ASERL presentation, and now we kind of have a longer view of our response to report. In the spring semester, as I just mentioned, many of the scheduled classes became asynchronous sessions. As we headed into summer, we only received requests from faculty who knew our work and wanted a previously successful online synchronous session. So there are 6 total of those in the summer. In the fall, however, our new practices were in place and some of the kinks were worked out of the system. Our digital library center had digitized a number of our most frequently used materials sets, and this wasn't a normal semester by any means, as you all know, but some level of adaptation had taken place and we were ready to play in the new arena. And you can see that here. In total, between March 16th and November 1st, we supported 48 individual class sessions, and 32 of those were synchronous and 16 were asynchronous. But I think the best illustration of our adaptation are the numbers evident in our Special Collections development site in Canvas. Since May, we've created 12 unique Canvas modules made up of 93 pages, 28 assignments, 5 quizzes, and hundreds of documents, images, and media files. At least 6 SCA instruction team members were involved in the creation of these materials. Now we have a bank of modules available to the FSU community on the Canvas Commons, and this is what they look like in the Commons, which is really appealing. These are never final products, but and we'll continue to improve them, but just having these pre-built modules that instructors can import and plug into their weekly schedule is a huge success. For a team working in a tool that was new to most of us and in a collaborative mode with instructors that required new levels of access, we're really happy with these outcomes. And I must mention our distance learning librarian, Lindsay Morton, who has encouraged and supported special collections as we've developed these skills.
So now I want to back up a minute and talk about sort of where we were. Now we have like the summary of what happened in spring 2020, like sort of where we were, like what are the things, what made us feel like we could take on this crazy task of like trying to pivot so quickly and rescue these 15 odd instruction sessions. We knew we had this team approach going for us, right? We had already had communicational workflows around real division of labor for instruction sessions, not just like who was going to take what session, but who was going to do what for what section, who was going to select materials, who's going to put things on a cart, who was going to be there to talk, who was going to be there to monitor use like you would in a reading room. We'd already sort of had that built into our communication. We were already in the practice of being responsive to course instructors and their objectives and their needs and their calendar. So we had been responsive in non-crisis times, and that gave us the foundation to be responsive in crisis. All that regular communication definitely contributed to our ability to make these adjustments. Not only that, but we knew we already had robust digital and online resources to work from. We're going to talk a lot about the digital library today, our digital repository, but also we have a lot of finding aids online. The rare book collections are described in the library's catalog. So we knew we had a lot of this stuff at our disposal, not to mention the amazing staff of the Digital Library Center who were used to doing digitization on demand. Usually came through reference services and not instruction, but it could be adapted. And moreover, we had members of the digitization team already on the instruction team, right? It wasn't about trying to reach out and build communication and relationships while the world was going haywire. We already had those relationships in place. And those resources in the digital library are wonderful. Digital surrogates, of course, go a long way towards helping all of our users. That's why they exist. That's why we make them freely available online. But there were challenges we had to overcome in sort of adapting existing attitudes and existing session plans to what we could do in an online arena. We all recognize the value of having novice students and novice researchers interact with the stuff, right? Like there's that affective response. There's that archival awe to like opening a rare book, opening an old book, smelling an old book, right? Same with archival files or looking at photographs or even seeing films in a can. Even if you can't watch them, there's still that connection, that real artifactual connection, the collapse of space and time that historians talk about. And there are things the digital surrogates will sort of let you do with that and that they won't. You lose a lot of that tactile and sensory experience we're talking about. There's attributes of artifacts that don't come out in the way we normally digitize them, right? When you digitize a book, you're sort of prejudicing for the content on the page and not, it's not as easy to tell like what the page is made of itself, right? How does it feel? How does it sound when you turn the page? How is the book bound? You're kind of losing, and those are all important teaching points for certain courses. And you do lose some of that with the way we normally digitize things. So what could we do? There are actually advantages, right, to doing all of this online, is that suddenly the things we could select from were bigger than our shelves, right? not only our digital library, we had everyone else's digital library at our disposal when we were adapting these sessions. And as we move forward in continuing to do online delivery, we encourage staff and students and faculty all to discover materials outside of FSU Special Collections and Archives, possibly at your institution, those of you who are watching right now. And it gave an opportunity to have conversations with students that maybe we normally wouldn't about how all these institutions work together, how all this content is contextualized, aggregated in the Sunshine State Digital Network, Digital Public Library of America, all these other institutions and platforms. Different kind of archival literacy than you would have if you were just looking at the stuff itself. But even then, where we couldn't find digital surrogates that addressed certain artifactual qualities, right? The motion or the use of something, paging through scrapbooks, using artist books, these are all real difficult things to convey through photographs or text, right? And so we made a lot of videos. And we made a lot of progress. You know, when it was catch as catch can in spring 2020, we did a lot of cell phone video, and that was okay because everything was better than nothing. And now we have other options, of course, and we have more time to plan. But just the things that are cool about books, the way they move, all of those things are helped by having these video capabilities. And something something I had to get over at first is not dwelling just on the disadvantages, right, of online delivery. There are some bummers, right? You can't always choose from your favorite things, but digital surrogates present other opportunities for discussion and instruction. Number one is that it's easier to present the same item to more than a few learners. Like in the online era, we haven't had to figure out how to have 3 or 4 students huddled around the same cuneiform tablet with a magnifying glass. They all have the ability to look at high quality, high resolution photos of all these things. And you can have an infinite number of learners looking at the same object. Having things all online encourages asynchronous access, right? Some of the point of scheduling a class visit is so that we can enable all the things that we usually do to mediate access to rare and unique and items that we don't want to walk out of the library or we want handled carefully. With digital surrogates, we were pretty free to put them in the digital library or in our online learning management system, and students can access them when they want to, right? They can get in at midnight after their other homework or after going to work. It actually got a lot more convenient for the learners. And then as we've talked about a little bit, digital surrogates are a natural prompt for discussion of some other primary source literacy topics that we wouldn't normally get into in a session centered around real stuff, quote unquote. The advantages and disadvantages of born digital and digitized materials, things you can do with the digital content versus the original content. And that's been a lot of fun over the last couple of months. And as we touched on before, normally in a special collections class visit, we don't have everyone online, right? We make crucial choices about table space, right? Would you rather have students bring a laptop so that we can work in the finding aid database, or would we rather leave more table space for objects, for books, for archival documents? In the online arena, we don't have to make those kind of choices. If they're working with things in the digital library, they're already in an environment where they can search for things, where they are looking at the metadata. And that, again, it's another natural prompt towards talking about search strategies, parts of a finding aid, hierarchies and relationships, right? Things that are like critical to archival and library practice that are not obvious from just like looking at an object in sort of seclusion, become really obvious when you have to look at these things in the manner that we represent them online.
So as we started putting things into our Canvas modules, we had to make some new considerations that we hadn't really thought of yet and try to decide if we wanted to set some standards for how things would be included. So one of the questions was, did we always want to import into Canvas, or did we want to set a standard where we left things in the digital library and linked out to our digital repository, how much information did we want to include with materials? Did we always want to have citations or bibliographies for activities or links to the resource? You know, making those kinds of decisions felt a little bit new to us. There were a lot of advantages to this kind of flexibility. These questions led us to some inventiveness and depended a lot upon the objectives of the assignment. So materials without context mimicked the material object on the table with only your senses to answer your questions about them and to open exploratory conversations about possibilities. We could provide as much or as little of the information about the object as we wanted to. We could still refer out to the digital library so they could see that the object came from a place. It was really kind of up to us and the purposes of the lesson. We could also embed materials directly in assignments, pages, or quizzes and ask students to share their screens and use annotation tools in Zoom to gesture directly at details of the items. And some of those details aren't even impossible when they're, or aren't even possible when they're viewed in person. There are some really incredible things that you can discover when you have a high-powered camera and the ability to zoom that lets students talk about the structure of a book in new and exciting ways. We also had to rethink our communication with instructors because it was really different in this new landscape, and that was just a practical concern to contend with. It required earlier and more consistent conversations about copyright and access, technological capabilities and timelines, which were incredibly altered, and how we prepared for in-person instruction. So asking for an object that we could just go get at one point is different if we're trying to get it digitized by the digital library for deployment in the session. Some instructors actually became really zealous, and like the moment that we found out about COVID came and like videoed and photographed everything that they could to get ready for their own sessions, which was lovely as we were still sort of reeling and getting ready for what was coming. And this image you see in the bottom right corner is from a website built by an instructor who put up materials that she videoed herself, or videos that we had also provided to her. And we knew about that, but it also opened up a conversation about what content needed to be within Canvas to bolster our fair use justification, just so we weren't just putting artist books out there on the internet, on websites without any sort of, guard against lots of access. And we had to constantly negotiate expectations and ensure that lesson objectives remained central in these conversations, that outcomes and information transfer were prioritized over neat things we can do or using a tool for its own sake, which is something that I think happens when you get put into a new mode of trying something. I think sometimes you just get excited about the technological possibilities and kind of can lose sight of the objectives. So keeping that centered was very important. The hardest part for me personally in moving to an online environment is absolutely the loss of the buzz of the room of instruction with primary resources. And Rory already mentioned the archival awe, which is a great way to put it, that it doesn't exist in the same quality or quantity in a Zoom session. And my favorite part of instruction is sort of moseying around a room of students who are interacting and asking questions and taking notes and pointing to the objects on their tables and exclaiming. And it's a sound that I can only describe as like the tittering of discovery. Like Rory and I have stepped back in a class before and remarked to each other, this sounds like a good one. Like you can hear when they're having great interaction with materials and asking questions. It's a beautiful noise and it feeds my instructor's soul, and it's just not the same. Dipping into breakout rooms isn't the same. And I've had to make peace with discovery, exclamation and awe happening within groups that I'm not privy to, and also develop a sense of trust that learning is still happening. If the exercise is built correctly, that learning is still happening, even if I'm not able to sort of see it all the time. It helps a lot to know existing etiquette or communication culture in a course and to find out from the instructor how they empower students to ask questions or to take leadership roles. So we often ask our collaborators to use the broadcast or use the broadcast to breakout rooms function, so they can ask students to send out a representative if they're having questions, or to ask leaders in the room to report back on progress, because that natural instinct of when it's time to move on to the next portion of an activity is diminished, and having a co-presenter or even an assistant or student worker from special collections who's deputized to monitor the chat can improve the flow of Zoom teaching. And one of the most crucial rules we developed is to put the instructions or the timeline of events in as many places as possible for an activity, on a slide at the beginning of the class, in the activity itself, laid out in the module, kind of anywhere, because students sort of access the Canvas module in lots of different ways. So having those details there means we don't have a lot of questions about procedure in the middle of an activity, and it just saves us a lot of time. As we adapted and created best practices in the new environment, we determined that our online presences, both internal and external, needed some bolstering. We've already talked about, brushing up the website and brushing up our tools, teaching discovery. We created teams to revamp our research guides and to make information about services more readily apparent on the website. Our libraries wiki became a central spot for communicating about instruction workflows, guidelines, and procedures, and even eventually incorporated a Canvas guide for those who are starting to build their first module. And as others experience the same growth and crisis, the community of archivists and librarians and special collections was fortunate to have centralizing communication pathways like the Teaching with Primary Sources group, and you can see there's Otero for lots of great activities and advice and guidelines there, and the Library of Congress webinars. And we absorbed and adapted as we learned from the expertise of our colleagues from afar, including the Society of Florida Archivists. Thank you for being here. Now we're going to share some specific examples of online instruction as it was adapted in the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'll lead off with kind of a simple one. This is a session plan that did need to change, did need to pivot quickly in the spring 2020 semester. The original plan was for a group of English students to come visit the Special Collections classroom, engage face-to-face with items from across our collections, and then the interaction would be sort of guided by their instructor, and it would form the basis of a reflective essay that they would compose after the visit. This is kind of typical of our interactions with a lot of English courses, in that it's not really about primary source literacy, it's just about getting primary sources into the curriculum, right? And then the pandemic happened, everybody pivoted to online instruction, and the instructor of this course chose to move to a completely asynchronous model. She just got rid of any simultaneous class visits, which means that this one had to be sort of what she thought drastically reconsidered and maybe abandoned. But in consulting with us, we were able to show her how this kind of thing could happen asynchronously, and it was pretty simple. We selected other suitable items from the digital library. Students were provided the links by the instructor. They were able to visit already accessible material on their own time, and they composed a reflective essay based on that experience instead of an in-person visit to the Special Collections classroom. So yeah, sort of a simple fix, but again, it really depended on communication with the instructor, just making the instructor aware of what could even happen.
The second one was a redesign of an extra credit opportunity given to students in a history of the Bible. I think it's a history of the Apocrypha class, actually. I worked with the course instructor to develop a pull list from our historic Bibles collections, and students would come to us and actually walk through sort of a chronology of Bibles throughout time, and they had a written response that they were required to do. And in that way, students gained better knowledge of special collections materials and also the topic of the course. And when we went to adapt this, it required some flexibility, but it also offered opportunities to include materials outside of special collections, as we've already mentioned, and put our materials alongside digital surrogates from other institutions' repositories. And that was a great opportunity for students to learn about how our materials relate to the larger collections. When you're looking at a text at the Vatican and you're looking at a text that's in FSU Special Collections, it's interesting for them to know that we share the same text. And I just wanted to include one of the slides. It ended up being a slide deck that students went through that gave you the text, gave you some information on the apocryphal inclusions or exclusions. And then at the end, they had to answer a survey and a quiz kind of thing. And then the quiz gave them more information about using special collections materials. This third redesign was for in-person visits to show materials connected to the history of ink, parchment, and paper for history of text technologies classes at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. And they were reworked into asynchronous Canvas modules that had built-in activities. So they ended up becoming more like interactive textbooks. The asynchronous modules walked students through the material history of the textual component in question and incorporated special collections materials alongside other representatives, sort of fitting our collections again into the larger landscape and chronology of material history. And they included embedded videos like this one you see here of someone actually making a quill, and as well as activities that ask students to identify a watermark in a database of watermarks or list common ingredients in a series of ink recipes. The module was adapted for graduate students with a longer writing assignment. And the creation of this module actually inspired me to ask administration for a Canva account, which just makes graphic design much simpler and quicker and helps to make modules look more professional and inviting.
Another example was, so the brand new course for FSU, it was always scheduled for fall 2020, but the conversation started well before we knew what fall 2020 was actually going to look like, around the rhetoric of sustainability, right? The way people and administrations talk about ecology and environment and sustainability concepts. The original plan was to have sort of a general orientation, not only to FSU Special Collections and Archives, but to special collections research in general. And then sort of a carefully curated selection of materials from which students were going to do an in-depth essay assignment, not as small as like the reflective essay that we talked about earlier, from all across SCA collections. And then of course that all changed when fall 2020, the instructor decided to put everything fully online, but really did and has retained a lot of the synchronous nature of the original syllabus. So the revised plan for this course, we had some lead time. So the instructor was really married to the original selection. So we had, in consultation with the Digital Library Center, we discovered we had the ability to do some on-demand digitization to support the primary source essay assignment. It helped very much. We had several weeks lead time on that. We were talking in the beginning of September about things that could be delivered in the beginning of October. If we've been talking in the beginning of September about the middle of September, it might have been a very different conversation. But the fact that we had this one so far in advance contributed to its success. And so these scheduled class visits, we moved online. We did have an orientation to not reading room use, but to digital library use. It was just last week, I think. The content of the digital library and how to search around in it. And then an upcoming session, which is really just Q&A for the archivists. It's really just an opportunity to check in with the students on their essay assignment that is more or less unchanged. It's just going to be online. If you're interested in how we did this sort of online exercise and orientation to our digital library, we did, I think this took all of like 40 or 45 minutes during the class. We didn't have the students do any outside work. We did it all during the Zoom session. We had students review. We talked a little earlier about our videos. We had the students review the existing demonstration video of how to use and search in the digital library. We made them the reference archivist. We tasked them with sort of reference requests, like real one sentence, things we knew would be easy to accomplish in the digital library, like find me a photo of of students performing. Find me a video of synchronized swimming, right? And the students really sort of took to that, like assuming the kind of authority of being the archivist, and they had a lot of fun with that. It's a lot of fun for us, the facilitators. We designed a request with certain items in mind, but we didn't really know what the students were going to find, and so that's always fun. That's always fun for us when parts of the session are sort of indeterminate. But all the found objects formed the basis of sort of group discussion around typical primary source literacy topics, about the kind of metadata that is and is not in a digital library record or in a finding aid. Again, discussion about rights and restrictions around access and reuse, utility of digital surrogates versus the original, and even a little bit of an opportunity to talk about our work, right? How things get digitized, why everything's not digitized, and how we make those selections from among our non-digital collections. And it's always a highlight of the session, not only to get to talk about our work, brag on ourselves a little bit, but I find that most FSU students are really interested in that. And so this is a side that we don't always get to talk about, but again, a natural prompt in the online arena.
And while Rory's students were sort of pretending to answer a reference request, this narrative stitching exercise that I've deployed before for a history of text technologies class asks students to put themselves in the role of an archivist. And sometimes like the archivist that has 10 minutes before closing, what can you glean from an item in 10 minutes? So it's an active learning exercise that I learned at Dartmouth's LALI, the Librarians Active Learning Institute, and we've deployed this a lot and successfully in person. It's got a good sound in the room. Everyone's very active and excited. The class is divided into tables of material sets, and they are taken through 3 phases of discovery. First, the student becomes a 10-minute expert on their item, and this really empowers them to ask questions and know the most in their group about the thing that they've investigated. Then they share out their item to the group and hear what the other researchers have discovered, and through discussion, they attempt to stitch together a narrative of relation between the documents. And finally, the groups present their narratives out to the class, and we've usually set it up so the material sets have zones or threads of connection that allow them to interrogate conflicting perspectives and ask really great information literacy questions. Taking that online was a challenge. We first attempted that in summer of 2020 with a class of 19 students, again, a history of text technologies class, and we put them into breakout rooms to mimic the experience of sharing a table of materials. And I wasn't very happy with that first attempt, and I had an idea of some of what was wrong with the design, but I really wanted some feedback and advice, and I'm really grateful to the SFA community for welcoming my demonstration of it, and many thanks to Mary Rubin for organizing sessions where we can learn from each other. So I demoed it, and in the course of that Zoom call with other SFA members, among other things, we identified some problem areas. There was low instructor buy-in. I had assigned way too many materials for students. I didn't really have, the materials didn't really have different views, and students didn't feel compelled to weigh in. They had no sense of stakes or ownership. And I didn't really know how, they didn't really understand how what they were learning transferred to other kinds of research and scholarship. And so now I'm going to share the class where I got to tackle narrative stitching again this fall. This class is a graduate class for religion in the South in the religion department, where special collections materials were used as a basis for building the structure of the syllabus. So we kind of came near embeddedness with multiple visits, repeating interactions with student pods, guest speakers, and partners with the technology, partnership with the Technology and Digital Scholarship Division in the libraries. And I'm also offering office hours to support their final projects. So we are a part of that class in many, many ways. The first visit, so I'm going to tell you about 4 visits. The first was University Archivist Sandra Berry providing a mini lecture and a Q&A on land acknowledgement at FSU, as well as the history of university connections to enslavement. You can see one of their readings here. I think it's 16 Years of Founder, documenting how one of Thomas Jefferson's grandsons was misidentified as the founder of Florida State University and how that error was corrected. In the second session, it was a module that was built with readings and interactions with special collections materials on myth making about indigenous populations especially abduction narratives and cataloging of spiritual practices. And this was supported by our books in the McGregor collection on the discovery and exploration of the Americas. The third session focused on public histories, digital humanities work with archival collections, and the ethics of studying a subject outside of your own community and a subject that is a site for public mourning. You can see here it was focused on Emmett Till. The conversation revolved a great deal around who we're accountable to as researchers and what the work affords in resurfacing historical context. So students were asked to participate in a data gathering project where we collected information about articles published following Emmett Till's lynching. And you can see on the right, we used the Davis-Houck papers to start that project. The data points that students collected included headlines, demographics of target audiences, and transcriptions of the articles with the goal to make this work available in the future. And it was a great conversation about the ethics of this kind of work, but then also like actually doing this work and how do you remain connected to the reality of the humanity of the people involved while you were collecting data points was a big conversation topic. And finally, we were able to rework that narrative stitching exercise with the input of you, SFA, my favorite instruction team member. The focus of the content was on Black organizing in Tallahassee, bus boycotts, and integration at FSU. And I narrowed the sets of materials and working with Rory, who has more expertise in this subject area. And based on his suggestion, materials were split into opposing views. So an additional step was added to the format. Students worked with a single item on their own. They worked within a cohort of materials with similar perspectives, and then they were put into a mixed group that now included perspectives in opposition to what they had just learned. And some great conversations came from this about archival absences, especially details about views from the Black community that were missing in the archives and these subjects. It also led them to ask great questions about how do we determine truth in history? How do we get to the truthiness of a thing? And it was a wonderful conversation. It was so wonderful, in fact, that we were really happy with the outcome and the information literacy conversations that accompanied it. We ended up deploying it for the faculty members' undergraduate class as well. And we developed another narrative stitching module about sharecropping that centered on the 1619 Project's podcast episode, The Economy That Slavery Built. And that's all for that class, but it was a really fun series of 4.
Outside of sort of session planning and session content itself, we've had a lot of other opportunities in the shift to online delivery, other conversations within the division and within the libraries have sort of been prompted. We were able to revisit some conversations we've been having all along about communications technologies significantly. We were awarded a grant to get 2 new document cameras this year. Rachel's nodding and smiling. A lot of our faculty and staff are really appreciative of these devices and how easy they are to use. And we can stop making video with cell phones and things like that. We did a lot of looking at sort of already available digitized content, not only in the digital library, but like things that we had scanned for digital exhibits or to print really big for in-person exhibits, really taking stock of like all the digital surrogates at our command, and then realizing that that's gonna flow back the other way in the near future, right? All of this sort of on-demand content we've created for online instruction is going to get reused in outreach, exhibits, blog posts, what have you, and of course in the digital library. So as we look ahead, like taking stock of what we've done so far, and we look ahead to 2021 and beyond, there are just sort of some open questions and discussion in the group about adapting these sort of digital and online content for other groups outside of FSU, other institutions, K through 12 instructors and students, putting things on the blog and seeing what happens. Those kind of conversations are able to happen now. We're still looking at documenting services. They're not exactly new, but we were never a majority online before spring 2020, and we're still sort of struggling with how to record and report that. Rachel showed some Canvas Commons content. We're talking all the time about how to get more, less course specific content and more like a la carte, like a menu of special collections modules that any instructor can and like would want to come along and grab to plug in to their own course content. We're talking all the time about hybrid courses, right? We're probably not going to go back to just like majority face-to-face after all of this is over. Like we're always going to have these skills and these options now. How are we going to deploy that in the future? For spring 2021 specifically, there's a lot of FSU instructors that are being asked to sort of plan 2 semesters, one face-to-face and one online. And that's of course trickling down to conversations they're having with special collections and archives. So the ever evolving effort continues there. And in the long run, now that we've been doing this almost a year, 3 semesters, right? We're sort of creating a generation of special collections researchers that have never been to special collections, right? And so they don't develop that affinity for the spaces, that familiarity we want them to have. We always want to seem inviting, and people are getting invited to other spaces, right? I think people are more apt to like email us or ask questions in other ways, but they're not getting oriented to those public spaces, the reading rooms, exhibit room, other places we want them to be familiar with. And we're going to have to, I don't know, those are questions to ponder in the long run. And speaking of questions, that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. Looks like we have a few minutes left here to take questions. I'll turn it back over to Mary.
If there's anyone in the Zoom that would like to ask a question, you are more than welcome to turn your camera on and unmute yourself. If you are in the YouTube stream, if you'll ask it in the comment section, I will ask those questions to Rachel and Rory. If no one has any questions, I have one. I'm curious if you have seen any students come back from classes and actually do their own research in the archive, or yeah, what is that like now?
Go ahead.
Did we both open our mics at the same time? That's how this works. That class that I'm working really closely with, I have office hours and their final projects are very open. And a lot of them, I have 2 student groups I'm working with right now. One is attempting to surface histories of LGBTQ plus communities in Tallahassee, especially around 69, 70. And then the other group is looking into the history of integration at FSU. And that's required some conversations about digitization when they need to interact with materials, but I'm also going to do some consultations with our doc cam so that we can have a real-time reference consultation. So that's all new to me, but it's exciting. So.
I'm not sure if Rory wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I can. It's Rachel should have gone second because her answer was better. The sort of maybe the impetus for the question is you're having the same experience. Is like some of those things were easy to naturally track when we were all in person all the time, right? You would really get to know the students that were in the class visits, and then you would recognize them when they came back to the reading room, and you would see those relationships forming and the interest forming with the students. And honestly, that was like one of the ways we like to hire people. It's like, oh, they keep coming back. Like maybe they're interested. And yeah, that's been a lot more difficult to track when everything's online. That's the downside. Unmediated access to digital surrogates is great in a lot of ways. That's sort of the downside, is that we don't, we're not able to track it as closely. See why I wanted to go second.
You did great, and it makes complete sense. There's a question from Carol Moon. Are you asking students to evaluate in session or after the session?
Assessments for me. You want me to start on this one? Sure. Yeah, we didn't really include that today. Probably could have gone another hour just on assessment. This is something that we had developed with the team approach. and sort of because of the team approach, right? We did have, where do I want to start with this? Yes, we did have like surveys we deployed before and after, like a typical orientation session for students. And we haven't really been doing those in the online arena because we haven't had any like typical sessions. We've been thinking very deliberately about the way we sort of construct these online activities, and that they're, I don't want to say self-assessing, but like designing our objectives so that they're like by default, if the student is completing the activity, then we know that they're getting the lessons that they want. And maybe Rachel wants to follow up on that. But I'll also say that throughout all of it, and we touched on this a little bit in the slides, we have always kept up with our end of the semester instructor surveys, where we check in with all the instructors at the end of the semester. And those have been really, especially for spring 2020, those have been really illuminating, mostly in showing us that we're on the right track with a lot of things, and then helping us tweak the things that could be better. So yes and no, I guess is the answer to the question.
I'd say it's not formal assessment, but a lot of the instructors assign reflections, or they'll have a discussion in the following class about it. And as we are included as course designers in Canvas, we're able to actually see some of those reflections sometimes, or I'll have a follow-up conversation with the instructor about the student responses. In one case, I actually was able to watch the video of the session following their visit, and I learned a lot about how concerned they are about grades. And because the activity was listed as a quiz, they all panicked, and they were telling their instructor that. And so we learned to kind of reframe our assignments to make them feel a little bit more experimental and like lab. So yep, we're getting a little bit of feedback, but not in a traditional way.
And I would add to that like, as always, that's an opportunity to like communicate with the course instructor, right? The course instructor has ideas about how these objectives can be measured, and they're grading things, and you know, following up with the instructor. That's part of the instructor evaluation, is part of the student evaluation if you're doing it right.
Any other questions? Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Rory and Rachel. I really enjoyed today's presentation. It's very insightful. And thank you all for joining us. And I am going to close out of this now. Thank you again.